Okay, it's live.
All right. Welcome, everyone. This is the May 6th, 2020 Diagnostics Working Group meeting. We are going to discuss the items market for the working group agenda. And we have a BPF presentation at the end this time. But first, do anyone have any announcements this week? Okay, let's go through the items then. So the first issue we have is async hooks, fastpath for promise hooks in JavaScript, which is on the core repository. Gerard, do you want to give some context on this one?
Yeah, I've been working on that one, and it's basically all done now. Like has enough approvals that could be merged now. Just wanted to wait for the meeting to just share it with everyone. Just see if anyone in the diagnostics working group had any more feelings on it. It's a non-trivial change to the async hooks stuff, so it's worth looking at carefully.
Were you able to run any benchmarks on that?
Yeah, so the promise benchmark file, I added an extra category because basically what this pull request does is it makes it so as long as you don't have a destroy hook, then it can use a faster JavaScript side promise hook. And so it's without the destroy hook is about a 45% improvement in performance. So it's quite a bit faster. But it's basically skipping all of the GC tracking stuff that destroy hook would normally do. So as long as you don't need that, then you can get a significant boost to performance. Like things like async local storage don't use the destroy hook at all. So should make async local storage much faster.
Do you know if that's a change we can import to previous versions, or if it's a somewhere major?
I'm pretty sure it's a minor, but it being as like complicated as it is suggestion to maybe not backport.
Yeah, that makes sense. But if we can get it on 14, I think it's important.
Yeah.
The only thing I'm just looking quickly is like, does it make sense in the documentation somewhere that to say if you turn this on, you're now going to have a 45% decrease in performance? Because
I maybe wouldn't hand out like explicit numbers because
sure
change, but yeah, something along those lines might be good. Saying like, yeah, there is extra stuff that this is going to do with the destroy hook.
Right, exactly, and it's significant so that it, people don't do their stuff and then just turn it on and it's like, oh, wait a second, what happened? Because this is improving the performance. Like, is it today? As long as you don't turn that on, well, I guess even today you have the performance hit no matter what, right?
Yeah. So the current way that async hooks works is it has the native side async wrap. Well, there's like promise hook subclass or promise wrap subclass of that, which it'll wrap around every single promise, like always. And every single time it does that, it does GC tracking for that object as well.
Right.
And there's a bunch of extra overhead to all that GC tracking and stuff. So what this instead does is it just puts two symbol properties on promise, the like async ID and the trigger ID, and that's basically it. So it just does all of that on the JavaScript side instead, so it can bypass creating the async wrap entirely.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So after the change, it would be good to have it documented, because that is something different from before. Just to say, hey, you're going to get a big performance hit when you turn that on.
You may be also aware that, for example, domains use async hooks and they use the destroy hooks. So you may get the performance hit not directly, you may get it implicit.
Haven't really considered what the impact will be on domains. The way it's designed, though, it will only use this fast path mode if there's no destroy hook. If there is a destroy hook, it just uses the existing code, so it won't hurt the performance any more than it already would have been, which is good.
For a particular, except for, so what you're saying is, I think for domains, it'll just be the same as it was before.
Yeah.
So and what I want to say is, users may enable the slow mode of async hook, so the existing one, not directly, they may do it indirectly. So it's not obvious if you document it. If you use the destroy hook, then it will be faster. If you don't use it, it's faster, because there may be some other user in the system which forces you back to the slow mode. Because it's not a single user API. The async hooks is a multi-user API, and if at least one user is using the destroy hooks, all the complete system runs in the existing slow mode.
Yeah.
Normal mode, let's say, not slow mode.
Are there any other things that we know of that will slow that down? It would probably be good to have that included in the documentation too.
I think it's mostly just the destroy hook. The GC tracking is the biggest expense. I have a bunch of other related things I'm going to look at to try and improve performance of specific scenarios, but there's currently like handle tracking, like requests. There's a bunch of cases where the request wrap is like, it has a JavaScript facing object that you just attach the callback on the JavaScript side, and so we could potentially just be wrapping there. So like that'll avoid extra hops over the native to JavaScript barrier. So currently, if you have like really handle heavy or like request heavy applications, then it could potentially have a bit of overhead. Like it's not changing what it was before, but it's something to think about, something that we're trying to improve.
All right, anything else on this pull request? Okay, so let's move on to the next item in the agenda. COVID-19 and working group sittings. So we have this item on the agenda just to check up with everyone to see if there are any changes we need to do, if everyone is fine with the equivalent frequency of meetings, or if anyone who likes to slow down.
I am fine from my perspective. I don't know whether we decided to have an alternative Wednesday sitting for the deep dive. Is it for one-off instance, or we continue to do that?
Yeah, I think it's still in the in the calendar as being the alternate week, same 1 hour slot.
Right. So my question was, do we meet next Wednesday for the deep dive?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, I'm fine either way.
Yeah, I think unless someone has a concern about having meetings every week, we can continue doing that. And if it's not working for some reason, we can reevaluate. Okay, anyone want to share anything else on this one? Okay, so moving to the next one. Report version semantics are not defined. I think I have the action item for this one, which I didn't do yet. Does anyone have anything else they want to discuss about this item? I try to post a comment about using schemas instead of versions later today.
I believe there is a issue about this topic, and we can maybe check this topic on the issue and post the links to the chat.
Sure.
Yeah, I think with respect to the discussion, we have some amount of consensus around when should we change the report version, which is basically when the structure of the data format changes. But then the contention is about what do you mean by structure of the JSON data? Is it just that the schema change or the key change, value change? There are all sort of combinations. If you look at the data, the key can change, the value can change, and the structure can change. So what would be a meaningful, reasonable line to draw to say that the report version should change when this one happens? That's where we are.
Yeah,
Schema is a good middle ground, I would say. So I agree to your proposal about defining a schema as the change criteria.
So besides the format and deciding when to bump the versions, we were also discussing that if we go with versions and we want to backport something, we need to backport everything so that the version that we are backporting matches the other versions on the node.js version.
Mm-hmm.
And it can get really confusing. With schema, we can just backport specific features without worrying so much about versioning, while also providing a way for users to verify that if some feature exists. Any, anything else anyone wants to discuss on this item? Okay, so moving to the next one. Proposal to drive diagnostics working group initiative throughout user journeys. We've been working on that via deep dives. And since last week, we are alternating between meetings and deep dives. So we are meeting every week, and 1 week additional working group meeting. While the other week we are deep diving on issues. We've done some good progress, I think. I'm wondering if we should keep this one on the agenda, or if we can remove it from now, since we are meeting regularly to discuss that.
Yeah, it maybe doesn't need to be on the regular agenda.
Yeah, makes sense. The one point I want to discuss on the user journey deep dive is essentially about the workflow. We sit as a team and do deep dive on different user journey items. And sometimes people take the content and proactively convert that into documentation. I forgot what was the original discussion around that. It's possible that some of the items which are discussed and kept in the user journey document is not converted or translated into the documentation in the repo. Did we have a conversation around that? I mean, I just wanted to understand, once we do the deep dive, what is the next step? Probably Peter will know about that.
Sorry, I am here, but what was the question?
Yeah, the question is, once the deep dive is over for a specific topic, say memory, what is the next step in the workflow? Will some of the people who will participate in the discussion will convert that into a documentation in the repo?
So I hope that we can make part of the node.js website. And I think I signed up for reaching out to the website working group, but I didn't do it yet. Yeah, I think that would be the highest leverage point, probably.
You mean the user journey document itself as is, or the documentation work which we have been doing?
So I think it's more like the debugging phases. So like basically both with how to do, with the tutorial. Definitely not the part about what to improve. I think that's mostly for our group. But I think there is a value in sharing with the broader community, just like what are the tools, the recommendations for the use cases, how to use them, and those kind of things.
Right, the best practice documentation, yeah. Yeah, so my question is more on the lines of, right now it is little bit loosely defined, the translation from the deep dive content to the best practice documentation in terms of who does that, when that happens, etc.
I am open to suggestion. I mean, the problem is, again, this is a working group, so we can't really assign tasks to people. So I guess our main goal could be just identifying the gaps and the work that could be done to improve, and maybe kind of pointing out some priority. But I think that's the output that we can make, and hopefully people will be interested and excited to work on them.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that because there are some newcomers in the working group, so they should not feel under the impression that okay, the discussions and the content that is happening in the deep dive is implicitly assigned with somebody or things like that. That's not the case. It's open for anybody to pick it up and convert that into the best practice documentation at their convenience, matching skill set, interest, and bandwidth.
Yeah, but I think you're making a good point that like maybe it would be time to just document the whole, like how we are doing a deep dive, like what's the process for that, what's the goal, what we hope from it, because it's like kind of living in our mindset, but I don't think it's documented anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the only point I want to make. Just because we know that it's in our mind, but others who are not well versed with the process,
Yep.
It shouldn't be a blocker for them to pick it up. Is all what I wanted to say.
Yep, that's a good point. Any chance, Giresh, that you want to write something on that?
Yeah, I will try.
Okay, I can help.
Yeah.
Thank you. Also, I have to sign out.
Okay.
Okay, so Peter and Rajesh will try to come up with some documentation process for how you're doing deep dives. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else we want to discuss on this one? Okay, so moving to the next one. Node CPU profiling roadmap. I added this one. We discussed last time the main goal of this issue being on the diagnostics agenda was to discuss collaboration with V8 with regards to profiling. I didn't have any progress on that. I don't know if anyone else worked on it, or if they have any other things they want to discuss on this item. Okay, so let's move to the next one. Async hooks, stable API, tracking issue. I think Stephen added something here. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've been working on Venables has an issue with async awaits. Anytime you await a Venable, there's kind of this weird dead zone that async hooks will have like zeroed out IDs and no async resource stack within the Venable. Like if you're using like async local storage, like before and after the await, you'll have the storage, but inside of it you won't. So I'm trying to fix that because it breaks like literally every APM. So I found a way to fix it. The way that's currently implemented in that PR is a bit high level and at the moment only applies to async local storage. I'm working on trying to make a lower level version. It's rather difficult problem to reason about. So it's a bit slow progress, but the hope is that I can get it working at a lower level. I'm currently looking at just shifting it to the async hooks level. I'm not completely certain like what the overhead will be to applying the fix at that level. The other option is to try and fix it in V8, which could potentially be faster, but also somewhat more complicated to fix. I've looked into the V8 one a bit as well, and yeah, it's difficult. Yeah, basically the problem is that Venables, with Promise Hook, it is attached directly to the actual Promise class. So if you're using something that's Promise-like but not actually a Promise, it never emits Promise Hook events. But it does get upgraded to a Promise. But when you do the await, or if you like hand a Venable into Promise.resolve, it will go through like an internal Promise upgrade step to turn it into a Promise. But there's kind of this like two-phase thing. If there's like the outer, there's like the outer Promise, or like the await itself, and then the inner Promise that upgrades is actually inside a microtask, which is unwrapped, but it has no async hooks context at all. And so that's the problem, is there's currently nothing linking these two promises together. So the context just disappears. So I'm trying to figure out a way to bind those together. So we can sort of detect it, and I'm trying to work on how to turn it into actual code right now. But basically, if you have the init events and it's followed by a promise resolve within the same execution async ID, then that means that it is like an immediately resolved promise. So either like promise.resolve or unvenable. So you can at least scope it down to those cases. It's one of the two. And then we just need to make sure it's always binding these things together. Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to look at the issue, but as it is right now, it's not ideal, but it works for async local storage, at least. As I said, I want to make a lower level version. The reason why I want to get some attention on it, though, is there's been a lot of pushback, like, not just for the potential overhead of it, but also like argument that it's not needed because like async resource exists, which I can sort of partly understand why people would make that argument, but async resource is kind of meant to be like an escape hatch. Like it's the backup plan, and like relying on async resource too much, like it's handing off context propagation concerns to user land. It has like cognitive burden to doing that, and it's also something that's fairly non-obvious when it's needed. And so like there's tons and tons of user land modules that are written where like, people didn't have the awareness that like they would need to have context tracking through their module, or would need to do anything special to enable it. It's like this requirement that adds this extra like cognitive burden to anyone that wants to write a node module for anything, because you either have to be aware of like, this is a potential problem in any async code, or risk breaking like the entire application. Like it's not like there's a lot of things to be aware of in Node that are like, this is a best practice or something like this. But this is a sort of thing where if you are not aware of this, you can literally break someone's app.
Mm-hmm.
And like it's not obvious that it should be relevant to your code. So as much as possible, we should try to avoid relying on async hooks to fix these problems, and should try and fix them ourselves if we can. So I'm just trying to figure out how to explain this in the issue and get a little more buy-in on, like, yes, we should actually do something about this.
So if the fix was implemented on V8, it's more likely to be faster and to be accepted, correct?
Possibly. I assume it would be faster, but it's hard to say. I don't have a completely clear idea of what the V8 fix would look like, but have like kind of some idea what it might look like.
I would say if it is in the V8, then there is not really an option to disable it anymore. Then it is just here.
Yeah.
So there is no discussion anymore then.
Yeah.
If the V8 does it correct, then there's nothing to do on node side, and yeah, it just is fixed, I would say.
Yeah. Well, the problem with fixing it on the V8 side though is that, like, I've taken this issue to the V8 team before, and they basically said, we don't have the time for that. We don't care enough about it. We're not going to do anything about it. If you want to fix it yourself. So like, we could put a bunch of time into trying to fix it ourselves, but that means it's V8 code that we have to maintain, and it's also V8 code that we have to figure out how to fix ourselves. Sometimes there's not an abundance of people with deep understanding of V8 internals ready on hand. So
when did you reach out to the V8 team? Because there has been a lot of changes in the past 2 years.
I've talked to them several times about it over the years. The most recent was, I don't know, probably like, well, it was the last Diagnostics, or last Cloudflare Summit in Montreal. I talked to some folks there. Yeah, the stance has persisted for several years that, yeah, we don't have the time for it, or like the desire to do anything about it.
I wonder if we can get help at least on designing this solution. Maybe coding will be our responsibility, but if we can get at least some pointers on how to fix it, I think it would go a long way.
Yeah, I've been reaching out to a few people trying to get some assistance on it, but yeah, it is a fairly complicated issue, so it's not an easy fix.
Okay. Anything else we want to discuss on this one? We still have 2 items on the agenda. Maybe we should move on.
Maybe 2 things here. On the one hand, I completely agree with Stephen here that this should be fixed before. I agree that we should do it, not move it to userland. And there was, regarding the stable API in async hooks, there was some initiative from Vladimir to move the async local storage class out of experimental. So not the complete async hooks, because they expose internals, so we can't more or less expose it. But the async local storage class could be exposed and moved out of experimental. So there is some movement in this area. So it's not yet done, but it could happen quite soon, I would say.
Yeah. I agree with the idea to move async local storage out of experimental. And I'm one of the people that's of the opinion that async hooks itself probably should never be out of experimental. It exposes a lot of internals, so at least as the design is now. Async local storage, yes. Async hooks, no.
Yeah.
I think the PR I saw was he was talking about putting it into a different namespace or something, but the comments were that doesn't necessarily have to happen. It could be non-experimental for, you know, within the namespace. It just would be that the other functions wouldn't be. So
Yeah, so here's
really
assumption.
has,
Okay. His assumption was it has to be in another module to get it out of experimental. So he started with the first step, but this seems to be not needed. So he stopped this PR, but the activity itself will for sure continue.
yeah, the original thought, yeah, was to give it its own namespace. But what we could do is just make it, like move it out of experimental in the current namespace, and then like we could create another top level module and just like re-export, and then eventually down the line somewhere just like move the code from one place to the other. If it's like re-exported, then we can just like move the re-export, just like swap places.
right, I'm
Go through
although
cycle of like it's moving out of this module into this module. Just use this in the future.
I guess I'd say though, if we thought that really should happen, it's easier to change the namespace now while it's experimental than to wait. But if we think it's okay to be
introducing a new namespace is a major bump, which I mean we can wait for that if we want to.
right.
I guess our own decision. Do we want to wait to give it its own namespace, or do we want to just say?
I guess is there any concern with it being in the async hooks namespace?
I don't think there's a huge amount of concern, other than like it does slightly promote awareness of async hooks being a thing when some people maybe shouldn't use async hooks directly.
Right.
If it was in its own namespace, we can just be like, yeah, here's the namespace. Everything in this is good. Whereas, like, exporting it through async hooks, it's like, but look at this. This object in here is fine. Just ignore all the other stuff in the documentation page.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in principle, you could implement async local storage with some completely other mechanism in, let's say, a year or whatever.
Right. I guess it's like, you know, the PR was like, the comments was like, you don't have to. But if we thought changing the namespace was still the right answer, to now is still a good time to consider that versus waiting, because once it's, otherwise I think it's going to be a lot longer before you can make that switch, right? Anyway, I don't think we won't come to conclusion here. It's just that's worth thinking about.
We probably should continue this discussion on async and bring that again on the next meeting. We have 15 minutes and 2 items on the agenda. Both items were added afterwards. We have the reviving the zones proposal on TC39 and discussions on BPF for Node.js Diagnostics. I think we can cover one of those in the remaining 15 minutes. Which one folks do want to cover?
I might say eBPF.
I'm suggesting move the zones library proposal to another session so we can discuss the eBPF.
Okay.
That sounds good, especially since Anton came specially to do that.
It wouldn't be a problem, folks. Always interesting to catch up on the internals. But thanks very much. Okay. So I guess we have all read the issue that I opened on 386, was it? Yeah. Okay. So what I've done, I've got 4 slides that I can just sort of run through very quickly. All I'm aiming to do is just to make sure that we're all on the sort of the same page in terms of what we're talking about with eBPF, why there's certain interest in it. I know, Matthias, you've been doing some fantastic work in this area, and the follow-up you've put into this post as well has been really good in terms of sort of some of the additional use cases. But hopefully this little bit of a presentation, and then with those we get some food for thought. Really, what I'm aiming for out of this is to understand how we could possibly look to enable the USDT probes in some builds for some Linux builds on x86. Sorry, x64. That's really what I'm aiming for. I know, Matthias, you put a PR into unofficial, and it's not clear to me, because I don't know the internals of sort of Node and how the structures, how builds get promoted, sort of how the possibility of getting that into a sort of an official release or some sort of release. That's don't necessarily have to answer that question right now, but that's the type of thing that I'm interested in. How can we get a branded release of Node with USDT probes enabled? Anyway, so that's my hidden agenda. But let me just share the deck, and like I say, we can just jump through it. Share that. Okay, can people nod their heads when they can see things? Yeah, cool, fantastic. Okay, so very brief overview of what is eBPF then. So eBPF stands for Extended Berkeley Packet Filter. It's also been shortened back now to BPF. Okay, so they're now used sort of interchangeably, but based on a technology that was introduced in the 1990s into FreeBSD, and it grew out into the rest of the Unices. Basically a little VM that was associated with the network stack in a kernel that allowed you to generate or apply filters to network packets going through the kernel. Okay, so that idea of being able to dynamically set filters within the kernel has basically been expanded out into a WASM, sorry, a reduced instruction set computer that is now embedded into a kernel. Isn't just on network packet events, but on a plethora of events that happen within the kernel, and I'll jump into sort of what those things are. The buzz phrase is WASM for kernels. So we understand what WASM is in terms of Node.js. It's definitely sort of comparable features in terms of what it does for the kernel. So it allows you to write little programs that you can embed directly into, safely embed directly into the kernel. Okay. So very quickly, sort of the runtime architecture then. So you have a set of registers and a stack, and then you have a pool of data storage underneath that they refer to as maps. Okay. So like I said, it's a very simple sort of reduced instruction set computer. And then in order to get a program into that, you start off, a user would write a program. This could be a Python script, this could be a Rust program, this could be a C program. This can be actual bytecode. But what happens is that the program generates a set of eBPF bytecode that's verified by a static verifier before it's loaded into the kernel. The eBPF runtime then runs the actual application and attaches your little BPF program to whatever pros that you specified when you've defined the program. So the bits that I'm interested in terms of Node is we have USDTs specified for TCP, for HTTP, for GC, and we can attach programs onto those events within Node.js. Matthias did a brilliant breakdown in the blog post, sorry, in the issue of all the other, what K probes do, what U probes do, and trace points. Okay, And then sort of outside, so you've got this little program running in the kernel that's attached to a set of probes. It's generating data into this BPF map. And then as it then fires events out of that, out of the kernel into the your user land, so you can consume those events, or you can let those events group into a set of statistics and then take them out as an async read. Okay. And then just in terms of the script, just closing off on this. So in terms of the script ecosystem, I mentioned that you have the ability to write Python, Rust, Go, etc., in order to generate those scripts. There's also a sort of a dtrace type language called BPF trace. It's very, very similar to dtrace in terms of how it works syntactically. So you have those two options. There's an external library called libbcc that you can use to integrate with the eBPF ecosystem, and then you can write the bytecode itself in eBPF. Okay, so that's a sort of little conscious of time, but that's a whirlwind tour of what sort of eBPF is and why I'm interested in introducing it into trying to get a build for Linux, so we can have this runtime, real-time probe attachment to node.js that we can build diagnostics and other interesting things off the back of, not just in the node.js layer, but how the node.js interacts with underlying pieces of the infrastructure like the operating system, disk, network, etc., etc. All right.
So what happens if the node.js runtime is compiled for support for this? And is it possible there's a mismatch or non-support in the operating system that you then, like we create binaries which are meant to run on any distro? What's the impact? Like I'm wondering, my first question is like, why wouldn't this just always be on, right? And so I'm thinking it might be something like that, but I'm wondering if you know what the problems are on that front.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned this in the post. So the kernel features that we're dependent upon are 4.9 above. I haven't looked at the behavior of what would happen on lower kernels. I suspect that where the real problem, that for kernels where you're not trying to probe or attach probes, that will be okay. Where you're probably going to have problems is when you have say a 4.4 kernel and you're trying to attach probes, and there's some mismatch there between that and the way that they're generated in later kernels. But I haven't done any definitive research on it, Michael, to be honest with you.
I'm just thinking, like, you know, if your kernel is not new enough to actually use the probe successfully, then it's like, okay, that can just be a limitation. It's more like if the binaries are going to now not work or be a problem for people who don't have the library, that's a different the kernel level. That's a different thing, because I think it's going to be. We've talked a whole bunch of different times about like additional node binaries, and there's a strong resistance to that just because of the extra work in terms of the build flow of building additional binaries, confusion among customers of which ones they can use. So the most straightforward path to get something that's like in the official binaries is if it could just be on without affecting anything. Like if it slows things down, that's another concern. But if it's just not going to run, that's certainly a concern. But if it's kind of like this can be turned on and there's no negative impact, then that is going to be a lot easier.
Yeah. Okay.
So answering the question about if the binary will run everywhere, if we compile with USDT probes to run everywhere, it already runs today, because USDT probes are just annotations on the binary that are not executable exactly, as well as a few extra call paths. But those call paths are not something Linux specific. It's, for example, tracking the garbage collector. As for performance, The way USDT probes are implemented today, I think has a slight overhead even when they are disabled on Node.js. Mostly because, for example, for the garbage collector USDT probe, we enable the garbage collection tracking on startup, even though we are not using it necessarily.
Okay, so there is some performance impact that.
There should be some performance.
Yeah. Okay.
It was not measured by anyone yet. My goal with exposing a unofficial build for USDT is to measure that overhead on production, and for other users to be able to measure it as well. It should be available soon. I just need to update the pull request. But in terms of compatibility, it's not a problem. I think the reason we don't have it enabled are the possible performance overhead and just the fact that the release machines are not they don't have the build dependency necessary to build with USDT.
Okay, is there a minimum kernel version?
No, we just need to install a library, so it should be fixable on Ansible probably. If we have Ansible.
Okay, but like it's not like you need a, if we were building on Ubuntu 12, which we're not, but like it would still be okay.
Yes.
Or is there some minimum level of the OS that?
No, if you're building on a newer kernel version, it doesn't impact anything because USDTs are not a kernel feature. It's more of a convention that was adopted by the eBPF community to attach to programs.
Right, but that, I guess that library that you need to add, I'm just validating that like that's available on older OSs.
Yes, it's been available.
Like you don't. Okay.
Over a decade, I think.
Yeah, I guess it'll be interesting to see the data on the overhead.
It's also,
I guess that. So go ahead.
It's also worth noting that I'm almost sure that our FreeBSD. Do you have FreeBSD builds?
Yes, we do, and they do have dtrace enabled. Yeah.
So those already have this overhead if it exists, and I think the same goes to OSX builds, and I think the same goes for Solaris and any BSD neighbor or sibling operating system.
And I guess just the last thing was the a couple years ago, probably now, I think, these kind of traces were discussed, but there wasn't really any champions for them. And that's kind of why nothing has happened, right? There hasn't been anybody who's been sort of committing to keep them working, tested, moving forward. So that would be the other piece that people would probably want to see, is that there's, some people who are saying, yeah, we're going to support this and move it forward. It sounds like, Matthias, you have an interest.
So for the FreeBSD piece, I've been diving into Chris Andrews' dtrace provider. So I do look after that in terms of FreeBSD support anyway.
Okay.
And that's sort of how I came to sort of understanding or wanting sort of the same features enabled on the Linux side, because it's been useful on other operating systems. So sort of not a full-time developer or in development full-time, so I want to be cautious about how much I commit, but definitely interested in helping with the performance metrics, gather that detail, and where I can, support in whatever additional effort needs to go in. So we have had, in terms of the features or the work that needs to be done previously for on the FreeBSD side, it's been when there's been changes in some of the operating system features. So the way that the arguments were being managed within the dtrace implementation improved between 11 and 12. So we had to jump back in there and sort of patch those in. And then I know Fedora had to look at how the probes are generated before they're mangled back into the executable. Fedora had to look at that about 12 months ago as well. So there's not but what I'm trying to say is I don't feel there's a lot of work in it, but when it does come up, it's fairly heavy work. You need to know exactly where you're at. I think that'd be my concern around it. It's again, getting hold of the expertise at the time is always the trick.
Also, Colin has been fixing and updating some issues on the Solaris implementation, which is basically the same used for BSD and standard systems. Mostly when there are some changes on V8 that need to be addressed.
What would also, I guess, and Matthias, you're involved is like in the user journeys and best practices. It would be good to have it like, if I don't think we've come across it as one of the tools to support those cases yet.
I don't think so. No, I don't think we came across these tools. I don't see it. The thing that holds me back on advertising these tools on the Node.js community is that it's very more aligned with kernel work than with JavaScript work. So it can be useful for Node.js core developers. I still haven't seen how it can be useful for JavaScript developers in a general sense, because to use those tools, it requires some low-level understanding of the runtime and the kernel.
Right. Now, my question would be, is it like not necessarily the end JavaScript developers, but the people responsible for a production implementation? Are they going to have the, if they don't have the required skills, then, I don't know who's going to use it, right? But if it's not the end JavaScript developer, but somebody in the organization who's going to have to investigate production issues, then I still think it makes sense to, explain the Node.js specific parts and which problems would you use to debug for that target audience.
Agreed. I think those tools would be more used by ops engineers.
Right.
And I think it also didn't come up in the user journeys that much yet, because those tools are fairly new and the use cases where they apply are still not clear.
Right. So that, for me, that's kind of important to understand which use cases these are important for, because that leads to like how important is it to have it enabled and available, right?
Yeah.
So that, I mean, not to affect anything that's going on now, but like longer term, it's kind of like that would help us to explain why, for example, if there's a small but noticeable performance impact, you might want to turn it on versus not, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. Given for a couple of reasons. One is that the operating space is kernel, but the problem determination space is the JavaScript in production. So there is a huge mapping that's required. So there is a level of abstraction also required. Number one. Number two, that there are a lot of tracing implementations when it comes to the user journey, and it's not a very well organized sector because you could trace from the JavaScript API like -- trace then system trace, Linux trace. So many levels of tracing exist, and the exact use cases or exact scenario where which different kind of tracing is used is not very well understood. So for these two reasons, I suggest or I agree that we should first run it through the user journey discussion to see which specific use cases this is precisely a good fit for, and then see how the the probes can be better abstracted or documented to improve the usability, and then see how we can take it up, evaluate a case for diagnostic working group to take it up.
Like, I guess, Mateus, do you have like some internal use cases that you're thinking about it for that you can share, or?
So far, I have used it on a case-by-case basis. So, for example, last year we were upgrading from node.js 10 to 12, and we noticed some overhead on some services where CPU was spiking to 100% for hours. And flame graphs were showing the hottest code path, but it was not clear if the hottest code path was happening because the calls were taking longer or because the calls were happening more frequently. And since BPF can attach to basically anything, it was possible to write a small program that attached to some functions, counted the number of times they were called, and relate that back to the flame graph. And so far, my use cases for BPF were always been these a use by case basis. Basically, if other tools are not doing that, I try to use BPF, which is kind of like a sledgehammer.
Right. Did it require though customized node build? Because it sounded like you wrote your own probes.
No, because I attached to C++ functions, which is also a possibility. But USDT probes, they do add some possibilities. For example, you can attach to GC to determine GC starting and stopping. And since you know that some GC events will stop the event loop and run until it ends, you can use that to evaluate how many system calls are happening during that GC. But then again, the only thing you can do with the information is fix something on V8 probably, unless there is some kernel tunables that you can mess with. So again, this falls under advanced users bucket. Just to measure time of GC, we have performance hooks. And I think there's a, not a misunderstanding, but there's a, the word tracing is not exactly, it doesn't have the same meaning on this context as the trace events we have, because the tracing here basically allows you to do arbitrary operations when something happens, whereas the trace events, they are used as to monitor time basically of operations. So even though they use the same word, they are not exactly the same feature. As a side note, we are on time. We are 10 minutes past.
Yep.
So maybe you should continue the discussion on the issue. I think a good first step is making that custom build available so folks can try it out. and exploring the BPF user journey through our user journeys documentation.
Yeah, I think that those two, they both sound good.
Yeah, and certainly on my side, the kernel versions and getting some clarity, even if it's only in my head, on that would be great. So I think those three things. But looking forward, if we can get the build from the unofficial, from Rod's repo, it'd be fantastic. And certainly with the user journeys, I think I mentioned this to you already, Mateus, my focus is on sort of Kubernetes and the container stack. So I'll be sort of trying to tie the two of those together as well.
Yeah, so Anton, I mean, my goal is that internally within IBM, we use the base user journeys and make sure that they work well in things like OpenShift. So that's a part of, it's kind of like we're in my perfect world, we have like the core ones, which we know apply anywhere. And then, you know, we look at OpenShift and say, okay, how do we make sure that we can apply all of those well in that environment as well?
Okay, it sounds like I'm getting a job there, Michael.
You showed some interest, so like, yeah, if you want to sort of join into that effort, that would be great.
No, fantastic. Yeah, cool.
Okay.
All right.
So thank you, everyone. See y'all
Okay.
next in the following week.
Yep. Talk to you later.
Cheers. Thanks, folks. Bye.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.